it really does need to be acknowledged every single time we see Palworld be brought up in the news cycle that the people talking about this game are actively malicious. They are actively trying to warp the facts and to warp the perspective to try and make Nintendo look like the bad guy. That they had every right to go after Palworld. They had every right to shut down Pocket Pair. They had every right to file the lawsuit. You know, we were talking about this early on. And yet you laughed at us like, oh, you can't copyright animals. Like, oh, you can't. Nintendo doesn't have the right to shut them down. It was all a gigantic giga cope right from the get-go, right? You know, I was talking about this, other Pokemon fans have been talking about this, but, you know, the gaming YouTube community at large really has been desperately trying to make Pokemon and Nintendo fail. I would argue throughout their entire existence, okay? Like, that is their goal, is to influence people to steer them away from Nintendo consoles, Nintendo brands, and onto the PlayStation, Xbox, and PC ecosystem, right? This is why Angry Joe will do a reaction video about the Nintendo Direct and say, like, nothing on it looks good, and then turn around and, you know, just say the PlayStation showcase yesterday was fantastic, right? It's not based on anything real, anything factual, you know, like on the games being higher quality. It's just their industry. This is what they do to try and warp people's perspectives to believe something that simply isn't true. So in the Palworld situation, the narrative right out the bat was that this was some hugely successful thing, that Pokemon couldn't stay competitive, that Palworld was this like brand new exciting IP with a lot of original ideas behind it, that it was better than Pokemon, that Nintendo was scared of it. All of it was completely untrue right from the get-go. But we've seen this over the past year, you know, ever since the lawsuit was formally announced, ever since like Palworld began making changes to the game, ever since like people began to realize that like, no, Nintendo has a case, they've had to like kind of scramble to try and find something to keep the narrative going. And right now, Nintendo has been trying to get the patents that they hold in Japan approved in the US. You know, they've had these like, you know, forever. They have to get they're going after Palworld for patent infringement, so they're going to the steps to make sure they're acknowledged in the U.S. as well. So the Pal Bros are releasing this narrative that like this isn't gonna fly in America. Palworld, Nintendo can't do shit. All Palworld would have to do is leave Japan and then come to America, and that would somehow absolve them of all of their crimes, you know? Like, they legit are saying stuff like this. Like, you know, this is like some Nick Rekieta tier lawyering here, right? It's the same kind of mindset, really. This idea that, like, the law can be, like, warped and twisted to, like, to benefit Pocket Pair, to benefit, like, Sony, to benefit, like, Nintendo's enemies, right? Like, the idea that Palworld can just leave Japan and go to like China, whatever, and then suddenly be like, oop, immune to like Japan's like very real patent laws. It's laughable. It is so off base and ridiculous, and really should be acknowledged as such, right? When you really think about it for 2 seconds, when you really think about like how this situation has progressed, like you see this for what it actually is. Like nobody actually cares about Palworld. Nobody is playing it. Nobody's talking about it. The game's irrelevant. It hasn't like no merchandise, no animated series, like nothing, right? It has been just a complete and total flop outside of the Nintendo hate industry, right? The only reason Palworld is being talked about right now is because Nintendo went after them for what they did. Justifiably, I might add. So, like, the industry is running scared because, like, when Nintendo wins, this should forever put, like, a giant hole in the idea, the narrative that something is going to rise up and dethrone Pokemon. This idea that Pokemon is a lazy derivative series with no innovation or no change, that's been, like, something that they've been trying to push since, like, probably when Pokemon Yellow came out. I remember people in like Gen 1 trying to tell me that like Pokemon games are all the same. Or like as if Red and Blue, like because Red and Blue were like the same, like, oh no, it's just the same thing over and over again. Like, that was the narrative back then. And it's kind of shocking to see how non-fans have continued this narrative almost 25 years later, right? They're so salty that Pokemon is so popular and is so beloved that people never really grew out of it, that that they have to like keep this mentality going. They have to try and act as if like Nintendo is somehow like this evil corporation that doesn't give fans what they want, that isn't capable of developing great new games. Uh, like they have to keep up this narrative because acknowledging Pokemon is like the biggest media property in the world would be acknowledging that Nintendo is in a position where they can't possibly be dethroned, right? This has been like the case for a very long time now, but the masses just don't like to admit it that like Nintendo is reaching the point where a console simply not doing well is not going to impact their bottom line at all, because they have their films, they have their comics, they have like their merchandising, they have their older things like, the eShop. Like there's just nothing the industry can do to stop Nintendo from constantly growing. Over the past couple of years, we've been told this that like Switch sales are going down, people don't care about it anymore, it's a dying platform. And then when you look at the actual numbers, the last 4 years of the Switch have been like four of Nintendo's most profitable years ever. The narrative that they were going downhill basically amounts to the fact that like the console Animal Crossing New Horizons came out in 2020. The most successful original Nintendo Switch game ever in that year. The absolute peak, and then they never recaptured that. Because the line stopped going up. Like, oh no, they're failing now. No, that's not how this works at all. And we saw this with Palworld, right? The narrative right out of the gate was that Palworld was this huge deal. It was this huge phenomenon. People loved it. That it was doing way better than Pokemon, and it just wasn't true because Pokemon had like what 3 releases in the past year, like Legends Arceus, BDSP, and Scarlet and Violet, all of which are way better than Palworld, by the way. 3 releases, all of which like outperformed Palworld, all of which were sold at a higher price, all of which like were tied to the larger Pokemon brand. Like it simply isn't possible for a brand like Palworld to catch up with Pokemon at this point. In fact, like even Grand Theft Auto hasn't caught up with Pokemon. Like Grand Theft Auto is like worth about a tenth as much as the Pokemon brand. Like Grand Theft Auto, the video game sells more, but it's not merchandisable. There's nothing they can do to adapt it to film or anything else. Like the video games are the most successful thing in the industry because of like stupid American underage children. But like Grand Theft Auto as a brand is not and never will catch up to Pokemon, which is a much more flexible IP. There is absolutely no hope for Palworld to keep up. And this is why the developers desperately want to create this very artificial rivalry with Nintendo because it's really the only thing that's keeping them relevant. They are the Sonic of the 2020s. They are like the Jack and Daxter. They're like the cheap knockoff brand that is supposedly like way better and more mature than Nintendo, but just uh it's supposed to be Palworld simply didn't have a shot. In spite of the narrative, in spite of the conspiracies, in spite of like the angle that people want you to go with this, Palworld's done, and it has been done since even before it came out. And the fact that people can't bring themselves to admit it, like, really says a lot about this. The idea that Nintendo is some super litigious company is just, it seems to be the new angle that like the Pretendos are going with lately. And I do think we need to start addressing this and calling this out because Nintendo has every right to protect their creative properties.